So you help me look for others. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, this morning, I would like for us to be thinking about forgiveness. And so some of the things we'll be talking about is, we say in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. But do we? Why is it hard to forgive? Who benefits most from forgiveness? So these questions will be at the heart of this particular session. So let's open with a prayer. Our good and loving God, we come before you in this virtual space this morning. We're not virtual to you, we know that. We ask your guidance and your wisdom, your insight. Open our hearts to be forgiving and to be forgiven. We pray in Christ's name. Well, the stories that Latasha tells, I think they're so helpful because she makes it so personal. And I really resonated with the story that she tells in this chapter about her own home situation and how angry she was with her mother for so long, her mother's behaviors, what she seemed to think was her mother's lack of love for her. Good morning, Bob. She had to get away finally as quickly as she could by going off to college. And it's interesting that she became a Christian while she was in college. And it opened her mind and her heart to think about her mother, her relationship with her parents, and realizing that she had to try to forgive her mother in particular, in which she did. And as she did that, she began to learn and to grow in realizing that parents aren't perfect. Parents have their own set of issues and probably even their own set of issues with their own parents, as in this case. Her mother had a terrible relationship with her own father. And I think this is probably something that happens to lots and lots of people. I know it did to me. I would share that I had a very difficult relationship with my father. He was an alcoholic for many years, and although he was never physically abusive, he was very verbally abusive. And that's all I wanted to do was to leave home. And I got out as quickly as I could. Got married when I was 18 and, made a lot of mistakes because of that kind of a reaction. It took many years for me to get to the point where I could forgive him, really forgive him. And I think it was when he became so aged and I had to take care of him. And our relationship dramatically changed. And then began to see him as the man that he was and the man that he couldn't help but be. And so I was able to forgive him. It was a slow, long process, and there's still days when I think back about it and think, if only, only he'd done this or only been like that. But I think Latasha was fortunate because that she came to a good relationship with her mother much, much earlier in her life. And as a result, is able to offer that teaching to other people. So I would stop there and just ask, is there anybody else who want to share a story of forgiveness that you've experienced?
I think I learned to forgive very early in life. And I think that was because of my mother asking me, does God forgive you when you make a mistake? And just with that simple reminder, she would suggest that I practice the way God forgives me to forgive other people. I was accused of taking something that I didn't take. And I was very angry, like you would be. And my mom put it all in good order for me.
Good perspective. Okay, anybody else?
I had a similar situation, and actually mine was 13 and 16 also. Like like the author's was. And my dad made a series of decisions that, excuse me, my grandson spent the night.
Good.
He's reading, I thought. That turned our family upside down. I mean, it, and took me a long time to understand and to forgive. And it's a hard process. And when it happens in the teenage years, I mean, it's never easy, but I think, you know, we're approaching adulthood. We're so aware of so many things, and it's particularly wounding at that time. And it's a very, very difficult process. And actually, I didn't really come to peace with it until I had to do my psych evaluation at Princeton, and it was quite a process. It was a whole weekend. And this gentleman is the one, the psychologist was the one who pointed me towards CPE and made me see the
Clinical
whole
pastoral education.
yeah, clinical pastoral, which is not, it's a fabulous process. It's all the training that you don't, well, it's not all. It begins you on the path to a pastoral identity that you do not get in seminary, because seminary is purely intellectual, at least mine was. But he made me see my dad's side. And because it had happened in my teenage years when I was idealistic and I'd kind of been stuck there. And it helped me to move beyond this black and white world of right and wrong and see the whole picture. And it was illuminating and painful and humbling, and all the things that I think we need in order to be able to forgive, and also to see my own responsibility in perpetuating my own hurt.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Mine was similar too, in that I had a father who was very ill, like in his mid-30s. He was a diagnosis. Back then it was emphysema, they called it. Now cardio COPD. But and I do believe he was probably raised harshly as far as how he was disciplined. And there were times when I was disciplined very harshly, and it was hard to forgive as a child, as a young person. But then I would listen to him struggle for his next breath at night, and it just helped me to have compassion for the man, in spite of the fact that I felt mistreated by the way I was disciplined. So, yes, it's forgiveness. I had to have understanding to have that forgiveness. So.
The difference. Thank you. Jen. Jen, do you want to speak?
Yeah, my experience was a little bit different. I had a really fantastic childhood, actually, and my parents were fantastic. My dad passed away when I was 27, and I did not grow up in a church. I went to church until I was 8, and then we stopped going, and I didn't really know why. It just wasn't something in my life anymore. We still prayed at dinner time, which was interesting looking back at how that happened. But my parents had been raised Christian, and then I guess my mom became what I would call now an atheist when I was about 8. And when my dad died, it came out that he had not been aligned with her on that. Like, he had supported her, but not, he was still a Christian in his belief structure. And it just, when he died and I found that out, it really affected me really deeply to find out that he would have thought that Christianity was real, but not have shared that with us. And it was really, really hard to kind of come to terms with that, along with the fact that he had just died, kind of surprisingly. So that was, I don't know if that counts, if it's after the fact as forgiveness, but
I think sometimes it's often after the fact.
yeah, it was a really tough thing for me to understand.
All right, well, let's take a look at the questions. They're start on page 117. And I think we've kind of done number 1. And so let's look at number 2. What are some ways that forgiveness has been demanded from the racially marginalized in our communities? List them and talk with a diverse group of friends. Well, I'm not sure how diverse we are. And we certainly have nobody else who is not white with us. But some of you've done a lot of reading and maybe talked with some others. I honestly couldn't answer that question with much knowledge. How do you think, have they been asked to forgive?
I have a comment.
Yeah, please.
The first thing that came to mind was the phrase in reference to Native Americans and to our Black brothers and sisters was, well, why can't they just forgive and forget?
Uh-huh.
Why can't they just forget?
Yeah. Right.
That was just one thing I came up with. So I want to hear what other people have to say.
Well, that's important, because I think we tend, just like we say, well, I never owned slaves. Why should I feel guilty? It's kind of the same sort of dynamic, well, why should they feel they have to forgive something,
When you read the book Caste,
Mhm.
you realize, it helps you realize where we fit in with the white privilege, even though we're unaware
Mhm.
that it's a privilege. And the fact that they are continuingly being not allowed to do what everyone else gets to do, or what we think of everyone is to do. It's, how could they forgive it? I mean, they're hit with it every day.
I do think they're asked to forgive also by being grateful for little changes instead of asking for big changes. They're supposed to just be grateful.
Mm.
We had a Black president, so everything is supposed to go away at that point. That kind of mentality that they should be happy with something we would never be satisfied with.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so I think that's a question that we can't resolve or don't really know the answers to, other than our consciousness have been raised, and as we go forward, our ears are better tuned to comments people make or things people say, like, why don't they get over it, or forget about it, or what, we know that's probably not possible in the culture that we are in today. But as we hope to continue to make small changes, perhaps it will make that we'll be able to do that.
One thing she mentioned in the book that I believe is real with those kinds of situations of abuse or anything is that it's a constant. You'll have to, the thoughts will come up, and you'll have to practice the forgiveness over and over and over. And I think that in anybody, when those kind of angers come up because of an injustice, you forgive and re-forgive, and constant.
Exactly. So number 3 says, list 3 reasons forgiveness should never be demanded. I'm going to give one.
I can't imagine demanding forgiveness from someone. I mean, that in itself becomes another assault.
Mhm.
Yes. Well, I remember Mary Ellen talking about it last week, though, her mother saying, now say you're sorry. How have we done that with kids? You know?
Saying you're sorry is hardly forgiveness.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, forgiveness is something that you do. It's not something you request from someone else or expect from someone else. It's something that you do over what you feel like you have transgressed.
Right.
And I think too, in that, I think demand is, there can be a request for forgiveness
Not a command.
with then a statement, I hope that you can forgive me in
Yes.
your time.
It's gracious.
Because like Sue said, otherwise it's just another ego trip. Forgive me so that I can feel better.
Mm, yeah.
Whereas if there's an acknowledgement that it will take time for the other person to forgive me, then that's honoring to their own process of being able to forgive. Because for me, forgiveness is almost a two-stage process. You can forgive, but you don't always forget. And some of that is self-protection. We're talking about racial divisions, but in situations of abuse, it's perfectly okay to take yourself out of the abuse and not be in the line of fire anymore if you're able to.
Mhm.
So in a way, you don't forget because you're trying to protect yourself, but yet you can still forgive. So it's not just this simple, I forgive you. It's a very complicated process, isn't it? And it
Yes.
depends on the situation.
Like she said, you need that time to
Yeah.
process your anger and
Right.
your grief before you can, and then go into your lament before you can ever get
Yeah.
into the forgiveness. You have to find the right space to do that.
On page 107, she had some questions at the bottom in italics that she asks us to consider. This is under the title of The Power of Forgiveness. How can you get rid of rage until you've taken the time to feel it? And often people do squelch down their anger and their rage, and that's often the source of depression. How can you get rid of anger unless you've made space to recognize it?
That's it. Mm-hmm.
And it's hard. It can be scary because if your anger is so such and you don't know how to express it, and you're afraid of what could happen if you express it, that you tend to mask your feelings. And then how can you forgive without first understanding the wrong and hurtful actions you're releasing the perpetrator from? And I'm thinking in terms of the African American community that it must be shocking to children who are coming out of innocence. And I'm thinking fourth, fifth, sixth graders, maybe younger, but suddenly realizing maybe they finally have had the talk, about being careful about police, etc. And suddenly realizing that your family, other people's families have been, this has happened to them over their lifetimes, your grandparents, etc. What a shock that must be to a child to suddenly realize, that they're an other, that they're different, that they are a minority, that they are not going to be treated the same way as white people are treated. Um, Walking a mile in someone else's shoes is a good metaphor for trying to get inside the head of somebody that's suddenly realizing, life isn't what they thought it was. Okay, on page 118, she says, do you believe forgiveness primarily benefits the person who has been harmed? Why or why not?
I think that forgiveness helps the person who is asking for forgiveness.
Who's
I think
asking for it? Okay.
no, that's not what I
Who's
mean.
giving it? Who's giving
Yes, it's giving it. I
Yeah.
think it really calms those thoughts during that process, and it gives you the ability to process that anger.
Got some others. What do you think? Who benefits the most?
Well, in my situation, I certainly benefited by forgiving the whole incidents and the things that played into it. When I got to the point to where I could just forgive it all, then I could move on with my life, and it didn't plague me.
Mm.
And it happened to be my ex best friend, you know. And I also had to examine what part I played in it. Perhaps I trusted her too much. But I was glad when it was all over. It was all over.
You could move on.
Uh-huh. And I don't think she ever even, I never even discussed it with her.
You know, I think that's often the case. I mean, some of the instances we've talked about, particularly with parents, they may not ever really know the extent of the hurt that they've inflicted. And like I said, I was 50-something before I really felt like I had forgiven my father. And I don't think he ever had a clue, you know, for the most part, that he'd been the way he'd been. So that's not unusual, Donna. I'm looking on her words on page 106. Latasha says in the last paragraph right before the power of forgiveness, she says, "That's how I came to understand the surprising truth. Forgiveness wasn't a gift to those who'd hurt me. It was a gift to myself." Mm-hmm. It's a gift of healing, just like you, Susan, sought out, maybe didn't seek it out, but you were forced to confront, you know, situation through the helping vocation of someone. But sometimes it turns out to be a gift that you didn't even realize that you wanted. John, go ahead.
I was just going to say that in my mind, the forgiveness is a movement to it, and then you have to keep fighting it as you move forward, because a situation will come up which will remind you of that situation that needed the forgiveness, and it just comes up again and again. Sure. And as it does, at least in my experience, has been it's less intrusive into your reaction as well as your life, and you're able to move beyond it slowly. It's a process, and it's not just I forgive it and it's all over. It's not over. It continues to plague you, I think, but we react to it differently, hopefully, over time.
Exactly. And how wise Jesus was to teach us, you know, that phrase, forgive us our debts, or forgive us our trespasses, or forgive those who sinned against us, because God wants to forgive us. And it's hard to forgive those who are holding on to grudges in their hearts. So,
I do remember learning too that not only does it damage you emotionally to carry around an anger or a guilt, it has a physiological toll. So you're hurt that way too if you don't find a way to forgive.
Exactly.
Carried around like that is like carrying a splinter in your heart.
I've noticed in other people, those who have carried a grudge for a long time and have been able to forgive, they just come back to you as you know, wow, that really feels good. I really feel so much better now that I've done that. I don't know why I waited so long.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. The number, kind of looking at number 5, how do you know when you have forgiven someone for something? And you just expressed it in terms of, I feel so much better, or why didn't I do that sooner? Can you think of other ways of acknowledging how you know when you've really forgiven someone?
You know, here we're talking about anger, and I'm sitting here with my white friends, and I'm recalling all of the times on television I've seen the riots of the young black people and some whites, and I'm thinking, for the most part, has all of that come out of anger
Rage.
or rage, which is past anger, or the height of anger?
Well, mistreatment was a word someone used, realizing that things are not, the feeling that nothing is getting better. And as somebody said, we finally had a black president, so everything was supposed to be okay. I heard him say the other night something that about him, I know that people thought when I was elected president, racism would go away. Let me tell you, it hasn't. Interesting dynamic. Yeah. Number 6 says, what
Jen,
specific?
did you have something?
That's okay. You can go on.
No, I'm sorry. I turned my head. I wasn't watching. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, in regards to riots, I think it's important not to just think of it as rage, because it's also desperation. Like, if the other routes aren't working, it's going to escalate, but not always because of rage or anger, but because you have to do something more to try and get your point across. And also, some of it is just not related to the protests themselves.
Exactly. But, but we're taught that, demonstrations are the way democracy works, that the people have the right to protest. And of course, when it turns ugly, like we've seen, it really it so deflects from the real purpose of people coming out. I can well imagine being caught up in one of those and thinking, oh my gosh, all this was meant for nothing, because now all they're going to see us as rioters and looters, and makes it really hard to want to go out there the next time, I suppose. So I've got one more question I want us to look at, and then we're going to look at a video for a second. It says, examine your life. What's specific to racism, colorism, or other forms of prejudice and discrimination do you need to be forgiven for? Who might you need to call or visit and ask for forgiveness?
I have one I've been thinking about just in the last the last week or so, and that in elections prior to this one, really, I have really mostly focused on the big election part, not like the state Supreme Court and the railroad commissioner and all of these other things. And this is my fault. But I read an article about a man in Houston who had been convicted of a crime of murder that he didn't do. And he spent 10 years in jail, and now is been released by the Houston police. Everybody involved in Houston has said, you're clearly not guilty. We even lied during the trial. DNA evidence proves you weren't guilty. And the Texas Supreme Court will still, and they've arrested who did it now. They found the guy who DNA evidence did find. And the Texas Supreme Court has not declared this man innocent, so he can't get a job because it says he's guilty of murder. And I was not even willing to spend the 15 minutes to look into the Texas Supreme Court nominees. And I feel a lot of guilt over that. It didn't even occur to me, when you compare the crimes white people have committed in similar situations, this is a black gentleman, they are declared innocent by the Supreme Court, and this one is being dragged on and on and on, and to this day he is still considered guilty. And I have some responsibility for that, because these are elected officials.
Right.
And I have not been even willing to consider the effects these judges would have on other people just because they didn't impact my life directly. And I feel like I do need forgiveness for that, and to make sure I keep up with those kinds of elections throughout the rest of my voting time.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Jennifer. And don't, before you beat yourself up too badly, we all appreciate what you're doing in this commissioner's race. So you are involved in
Yes,
taking
you are.
that next step. So good for you. Was anybody else who thought of one? This whole thing of colorism, which we talked last week, I find to be extremely interesting, and I'm become very aware. I'm just reading a review of a book this morning that I want to get called, it's a novel, The Vanishing Half. And apparently it's about two twin sisters who were born, they grew up in a community where they didn't want anybody that was black. They wanted them all to be, lightly colored. But one sister goes off and passes for white, while the other sister marries a darker man, and suddenly she's incognito or unwelcome in her community. It sounds like it's a really good novel. I'm going to try to read it, but that has been a real learning in this course for me, is this whole issue of colorism, which I had never crossed my mind. But the impact of it in the African American community primarily.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, the one place that Natasha brings out the incredible witness of forgiveness is in the people who were impacted by the shooting in the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, by a white supremacist, Dylan Roof. And I think we're all pretty familiar with the story of how he showed up there. It was a Wednesday night Bible study, and their pastor was even a state senator, I think, or state House representative. And there were, I don't remember exactly, like 12 of them there. And he ended up killing 9 out of the 12. 2 were shot and survived, and 1 he left on purpose. He said, "I want you to tell the story." And now the part that she tells that I didn't know about was the judge, and what the judge had said to the jury about taking into account his family and the impact on them, and how angry that made African Americans, obviously. But then there were these incredible women who came forward very quickly and said to Dylan Roof that I forgive you. And I found a video clip of them, and I'd like to show that to you right now. So bear with me here while I share my screen.
This morning's special series, Finding Forgiveness, and we're hoping to shine a light on triumph over tragedy with an incredible spirit that's really inspiring you.
We can't hear it, Judy.
Okay.
Church in Charleston, South Carolina.
I think it's just the volume.
Let me get my volume up. Is that better?
For most of us, forgiveness.
Yeah, could you do it a little more?
How did those families who lost so much find that power, the power of forgiveness? I headed to Charleston to meet with 3 extraordinary women. Three women whose lives are intertwined by fate and their sheer amazing grace.
Police and emergency responders are on the scene at what police confirm is a shooting inside a church in downtown Charleston. That church is known as Mother Emanuel.
Sanders' beloved Aunt Susie was killed that day. So was her 26-year-old son, Tawanza, who had a lifetime of promise ahead of him. He worked 2 jobs and was a gifted poet.
Holly Shepard survived that day as shots rang out, words from the shooter she will never forget. I'm going to leave you to tell the story. Jennifer Pinckney's husband, the Reverend Clementa Pinckney, was also among the 9 killed that tragic day 3 years ago. We were his girls, and we're going to be right here for each other. I caught up with these 3 incredible women at the Second Presbyterian Church, 1 block from the crime scene. I feel like I'm around strength. I don't know about you, but that's what it feels like. Do you feel strong? Some days you can conquer the world, and other days you just want to hurry up, go away. Today, their voices are being heard, preaching about the power and purpose of forgiveness. I don't know if you guys know this, but I don't consider you victims. I consider you teachers, 3 people who could teach us something. We watched you go through pain. We watched you on your knees. We watched you hug your community. And then we watched something that I feel like is a miracle. We have to forgive. Just 2 days after losing their loved ones, family members said they forgave the shooter. And I forgive them. But may God have mercy on you. How hard were those words? It wasn't hard at all. I had some other things to say to go with it, but someone behind me started crying. What people don't know is that there was a silence in that room. It felt so serene in that room. There was a calmness in that room. Me and Miss Foley watched my son take his last breath. But for me to be kneeling right over him and looking at how beautiful he was, and he seemed like he was at peace. Holly describes a light in the room that seemed almost spiritual. And there was a light in that room. It's almost like the lights was off in the room. Yes. It was like we were in the twilight. There was 2 different lights in that room. He had a lace on that gun. That was one of the lights. But the other light was, it was a quiet. It was like you were in a different world. She says she felt God's presence. I have no doubt that he was in that room with us. With all that loss, you still know he was in the room with you. I know God was in that room, yeah. I know that we're all people, and you feel the same pain, and you feel the same hope. So, Holly, for you, the idea, I would think that you'd be livid, angry, want revenge, want to just take the guy by the throat, you know? I was that way at first. But then I thought about Felicia. Felicia lost her son. And I said, she could forgive. Why are you so hard-hearted you can't forgive? So from that day on, I had a release. Because forgiveness is like, you think you let somebody else off the hook, but you're actually letting yourself off the hook. Because if you keep it, there's no healing with hatred. You have to love each other. That's our 2nd commandment. You have to love each other. Yes. Jennifer, forgiveness doesn't come easy. No, it doesn't. When someone robs you of your husband, which is just what that man did, where are you on your journey? You know, you always want to forgive, and that's what we're taught. You know, sometimes I feel like I teeter-totter, but then I know that it's the right thing to do is to forgive. You know, it's what we've taught our girls. I don't teach them to hate. Have you forgiven him? To a certain extent, yes. But not all the way. Sometimes when I look at my girls and what they've, you know, they won't have the father-daughter dance. They won't have daddy to walk them down the aisle. I think about them and their future and what they're missing out. Felicia Sanders says it hasn't been easy for her granddaughter, whom she saved by laying over her body during the attack. I grieve for my granddaughter. I really grieve for her. No 11-year-old child should be in combat. So I have to be strong for her. Yes, you do. Mm-hmm. And I understand that wholeheartedly because I have to. Yes. You got to be strong, you know. Don't you get tired sometimes of always being strong? Do you ever get tired? All the time. Yes. Yeah. All the time. And it tells you in Matthew 6, right after our Father's prayer, you have to forgive others for you to be forgiven. I would say from us forgiven, we can go on. We can wear a smile. We can smile. The families and the victims were honored by President Obama, who spoke at Pinckney's funeral.
What a life meant to Pinckney lived.
When I saw Barack Obama give the eulogy for your husband, I have to say, when he started singing Amazing Grace,
Amazing grace,
Amazing Grace,
how sweet the sound
that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
My goodness.
Wow, weren't they something?
My goodness. I covered Senator Pinckney years ago and managed to spend some time with his wife shortly after the shooting, and it sounds like she's come a bit of a ways, but not quite where the two other women are.
I think they all say forgiveness is a process. Like, you can forgive on Monday and still be angry on Friday, but you wake up every morning and forgive a little.
It's like, I don't know if I'll hear Amazing Grace the same way, because that is Amazing Grace.
That was
They're
powerful.
personifying Amazing Grace.
They are something.
I knew you had such a delightful voice.
We're going to have a lot more on today.com, including a moment that really moved us. It was a gospel choir that performed Amazing Grace in that church. We're back right after this.
Well, every time I've watched that, I've cried. So
Wow.
it's pretty powerful.
It is. It is. And it is amazing grace that God has and gives for us and to us. It's amazing.
I actually something similar to that as a kid. When I was a senior in high school, I had a friend whose brother had been brutally murdered a few years prior. And when his sentencing, they found him guilty, the kid who did it. And at the sentencing trial, you know, the families are usually asked if they given the opportunity to speak. And she chose as just a teenager to speak on behalf of the murderer. And she also did she openly forgave him in court and to me personally, and asked that his sentence not be, he was eligible for the death penalty, and she advocated against him getting it, which I'm still so moved by her ability to have done that. And doing it during, adolescence would just make it that much harder.
Yes.
So it is so moving.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine. Well, I don't think I can say anything else. I think that video really summed up what we've been trying to say this morning and what
It's a
Latasha
process.
trying to teach. Yeah. As I said, John, is your hand up or no? You're going. Okay. All right. Let's look on page 119, which is our prayer. And if you will read along silently, I will read it aloud. Let us pray. God, I thank you for your word and everlasting love. Thank you for providing us a clear path to reconciliation, one that builds bridges, closes gaps, and showcases your plan for us all. There is so much strife and conflict attempting to distract us from who you are, closing our minds and hardening our hearts against one another. I pray we are loosened from the chains of unforgiveness and that our hearts are softened toward one another, so our journey forward together as your children will be victorious. Help us see your love in one another and strengthen our desire for community and oneness in you. Open our ears to listen to the stories of those around us so that we may better understand one another. Help us to release negative thoughts and ideas about others, even if there are past hurts, and to forgive. Thank you for forgiving us and fiercely loving us even when we have chosen to turn our backs on you. It is only by your grace we are able to walk this path. In your name, amen.
Amen.
So chapter 7 for next week, and we'll move forward. So have a good week, everybody.
Thanks, Judy.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Judy.